Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is so fantastic to see. First of all, I guess I need to thank all of you for coming tonight, because this is, yes, who said social justice can't be fun? So, tonight, how many of you were at last night's keynote with, oh, yes, excellent. Okay, so I won't have to go into the story again. But for those of you who missed out on last night, I just want to let you know that this event tonight and last night was really 19 years in the making. And for those of you who are in certain classes that are here, that's going to be on your test. So, I was an undergraduate here in 1991, and that's where this really all began. In a cross-cultural anthropology class taught by James Lauke. And, he had us read the first edition of Affirming Diversity. And that book changed my life. So, of course, last night I said to students, make sure you read your books, because these, what you're reading here at Western is really powerful. So I had the opportunity to meet the scholar who wrote Affirming Diversity, which is Dr. Sonia Nieto, and who was extraordinarily gracious, invited me to come study at the University of Massachusetts, where I met Patty Bodie, who is also an extraordinary 16-year veteran in the classroom, but also a scholar, a social justice art educator. And she is currently the director of art education at Tufts University. I'm not following my notes very well. Forgive me. So let me go back. I'm going to do introductions in a minute. But I do want to say that besides this being 19 years in the making, this couldn't have happened tonight without some stellar leadership. And so first I'd like to thank Woodring College of Education and particularly our Dean Salzman. Thank you. I just want to mention that it takes a truly courageous leader to create avenues for transformative praxis. And that's really what tonight's about. Tonight is about moving beyond the rhetoric in schools of education and our K-12, our pre-12 system. We do a lot of talking about what multicultural education is, what social justice and diversity is, but oftentimes we don't actually pay attention to what those definitions mean and take them into action. So tonight, our panelists are really going to speak to how can we move beyond the rhetoric, and what does multicultural education look like in the 21st century? Of course, I just jump around, that's an indigenous thing. All right, so I want to go back to my thanking of people too. We also couldn't have this event tonight or last night without Catherine Collier, who received the Circle Grant. So this is an effort to make sure that our campus really honors language and culture, as well as diversity and social justice. And I do have to thank our SEED staff. So if you're a SEED staff member, would you please stand up or wave your hand? They're all working, so you can't really do it. Thank you. We have the best co-coordinators, Linda Spalding and Jeremy Anhalt, and we also have an incredible staff, Elaine Mahari, Valerie Loeb, Belina Van, Chelsea Ross, and Kelly Bearfield. Just incredible people. And I also would like to recognize Lorraine Casperson. Lorraine, would you please stand? Lorraine really had a vision for the center, which at the time, in the past, for most of its history, was the Center for Educational Pluralism. And she really took the center from a library and turned it into an incredible space that hopefully in the future we'll continue to see as not just a Western or Woodring center, but a nationally recognized center. All right, so again, we also have students from Educational Equality who are here tonight helping us, so thank you very much. We really appreciate their efforts as well. So okay, so let me get back to the story. This event really is a bit selfish on my part, because I'm an admirer of all the people sitting up here in this panel. And so, of course, I wanted to hear them, because I'd love to see what we can actually do if we come together as a community in solidarity to make change take place. So thank you all for participating in that this evening. So when we were thinking about this, it goes along with what happened last night in Reigniting Multicultural Education, Patty and Sonia's presentation. And it was a really powerful evening, and those of you who are there can probably attest to that, that I'm sure you went home really thinking about education and the socio-political context. And tonight we're going to continue that education. Sonia and Patty set the foundation for us. And the title of our presentation really came from an article by Marilyn Cochran-Smith. And she really asked us to look at how we could move beyond the rhetoric. And we're not just focusing tonight on teacher education, although we do have teacher educators up here. We're also addressing university and school systems. And actually, you could probably take a lot of the information that you're learning tonight in other areas and fields as well. So what do we mean by a new multicultural education? Well, that wouldn't necessarily add to existing structures and paradigms. It's a reinvention. It's challenging traditional ideological underpinnings. It's placing knowledge about culture and racism front and center. It's also valuing the cultural knowledge of local communities. I want you to be thinking about that. Our Denny Hurtado tonight will be speaking to that specifically from an indigenous colonizing perspective. It's also focusing on social justice, and we have Dr. Ken Zeigner here, who I still get nervous around because he's so wonderful. And it's so great to actually read scholars and see them, and I'm already nervous just talking about it, so I apologize, Dr. Zeigner. And tonight the panelists were chosen because they're all leaders in the field. And for those of you who have had the privilege of reading Dr. Nieto and Dr. Bodie's book, Affirming Diversity, you are one of many across the nation who have experienced this very inclusive look at multicultural education, and very critical. And hopefully, if you haven't read it yet, please check it out tonight, or come to see it and check it out. So I do want to just briefly introduce our panelists, and they're sitting in order of where they'll be speaking. Patty, again, is the Director of Art Education at Tufts University, and she's a critical art pedagogy-based educator. She was in public schools. She's been prolific in writing about anti-racist curriculum reform, and she really is an incredible. Her praxis, her bridging theory and practice together with teachers is incredible. And for those of you who were here last night to see, a lot of people ask me in classes, how do you do multicultural education? What does it look like? What is social justice in the classroom? And Patty does it so effortlessly and makes it doable for us. So thank you, Patty. Gary Howard. Wow. He's on the panel too. I still get nervous about Gary. Gary he was the founder of REACH, which has been around for 35 years. It's hard to imagine looking at Gary that he could be working in social justice and multicultural education work for 35 years as an activist. And the REACH Center, we are so fortunate. We're in the process of having the REACH Center physically moved to the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity. Yes. And then I get to work with all the REACH people. So I do want to honor the REACH family that's here. So if you are a part of REACH, if you've been trained, if you are a board member or on the steering committee, would you please stand? Okay, so Gary, though, he was the founder of REACH, but he's doing all sorts of wonderful things. Not that he has let go of REACH, but he is moving forward into directions around out of teacher education specifically and into institutions. So he's been working on the Gary Howard Institute for Institutional Change and doing incredible work in school districts. So, and I also have to recognize that he is the author of the nationally renowned book, We Can't Teach What We Don't Know, White Teachers, Multicultural Schools, Multiracial Schools, Multicultural Education. And, Gary really speaks to the role of white educators in multicultural society. So tonight we're going to hear his perspectives as well. Thank you, Gary. Denny. Denny, I could spend the whole evening speaking about Denny and the work that he's done over the years. Denny is a leader. He is the Director of Indian Education for the state of Washington for the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And, you know, that's enough, right? But I could go on to tell you that he's been a leader for a very long time. He's been not only a classroom teacher, but also the Skokomish Tribal Chairman, Council Leader, Vice Chairman, and Council President. So he has committed his adult work life and, you know, I can say his heart to Indigenous rights and justice. And he's currently developed, which will be up for teachers and teacher educators and anyone who wants the knowledge, a curriculum called Since Time Immemorial, Tribal Sovereignty in Washington State. And it's really an honor, Denny, to have you here. I know he's not doing too many speaking engagements these days because he's so busy, so you should all be very grateful. I know I am. And Dr. Ken Zeichner is, I had experience reading him, and then having the opportunity to work with him with the American Educational Research Association and helping graduate students to learn more about the importance of teacher education and social justice. And he was at that time at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's here in Washington. Yay! As the Boeing Professor of Teacher Education and Director of Teacher Education at the University of Washington, Seattle. And of course, Dr. Zeichner has made an enormous contribution to teacher education and social justice, and will be speaking to us tonight about that. He's widely published, but he has a brand new book called Teacher Education and the Struggle for Social Justice. Perfect. So please welcome Dr. Ken Zeichner as well. And then finally, Dr. Sonia Nieto. Not only was she my mentor at UMass Amherst and very gracious when I approached her in a bathroom and told her that I was her biggest fan. And she didn't call security, she didn't have me kicked out of the conference. She invited me to have lunch, which was incredible. And I was just a classroom teacher who didn't really see myself in a leadership role at the time, but Sonia said something and invited me to come work with her, learn from her at the University of Massachusetts. So those of you who know, when you're a Washingtonian, traveling 3,000 miles to Massachusetts is a pretty unbelievable journey, and I made that to work with my very wonderful mentor and scholar, Dr. Sonia Nieto. So I could go on and spend all our time talking about the panelists, but what I want to do is just set the stage for you and give them the opportunity to speak. They're going to each have 15 minutes to speak to the questions that were posed about how do we move beyond the rhetoric. And so I asked them specifically, in schools and universities, we use those terms, multicultural, social justice, and equity. But what do they really mean to us? And how can we move beyond the rhetoric and walk the talk, not just talk the talk? And incorporate tonight the wisdom of our panelists into our everyday practice, not just at Martin Luther King Day, not just during the month of November when we have Thanksgiving and right after Columbus Day, but every day. And when I talk to my students, I talk about everyday anti-racism. It's like exercise. You should exercise at least 3 times a week. In terms of anti-racism or anti-discrimination, we should be doing that at least 3 times a week, if not every day for an hour. So tonight, though, we're asking our panelists, we want to consciously reinvent our systems, universities, and reimagine our schools in order to achieve educational equity. So how do we do that? And one of the quotes from Marilyn Cochran Smith states that, we really cannot afford not to address this question. So I'm going to ask our panelists to share with us for 15 minutes each their perspectives on how we can move forward, and then we'll have time for questions after this. So, one thing about questions. In your programs, you have a piece of paper in there that you can write a question down. So we're going to do it two ways, because I know oftentimes it's difficult to come up to a microphone and ask a question. So we're going, if you have a burning question, we'll take that towards the end. We won't be able to get to everyone's question, but I was kind of dreaming about that today, so maybe we can share the questions with our panelists later, and maybe in the future we'll get some feedback. And so please think about the panels and come up with some questions, and we'll do a good question-answer session. Thank you again for coming, and thank you, panelists.
Hello, everybody. Kristen introduced us backwards, so that's why I'm coming up first. Thank you, Kristen, for the introduction, and again for providing this wonderful 2 days for us to work here at Western and meeting incredible people that you work with. So I want to talk about this moving beyond the rhetoric. And, Kristen sent us Marilyn Hawkins-Smith's article that asks some really essential questions about teacher education and how it could be more multicultural. And I found that really helpful. But I want to start with my own question. And the question is, what's wrong with the old multicultural education? There's really nothing wrong with it if you think back to the roots. Now, some of you were there last evening when I quoted Mildred Dykeman in an incredible article from 1973, and I want to just repeat some of that here. Because perhaps instead of creating something entirely new, moving beyond the rhetoric means embracing and building on the old multicultural education, especially on the very progressive legacy of multicultural education. And what I mean by that is that there's always a gap between the rhetoric and the reality, the rhetoric and the practice. But I think it's gotten worse in some ways. That that our rhetoric is okay. Our practice we need some work on. Our rhetoric before wasn't bad. And so I want to just quote from this wonderful article, or book chapter, that was written by Mildred Dykeman in 1973. So this is in the Stone Age of multicultural education. And it was just starting as a field. Of course, Jim Banks was the editor of this volume because he was there from the very beginning. And this was the 43rd yearbook of the National Council for the Social Studies, and it was on teaching cultural pluralism. That was the language that was being used then. So Mildred Dykeman was an anthropologist. We never heard of her after this chapter. I never saw anything that she wrote after this. And it's sort of a shame because she was very incisive, very insightful. So she was an anthropologist by training and had been at Sonoma State. She starts by saying, American schools are racist by design. Their racism is part of a larger philosophy, an ethnocentric dedication to the remodeling of citizens to conform to a single, homogeneous, acceptable model. She also said that schools are, quote, a massive system of public indoctrination and the major sorting mechanism in this society. That is, that it sorts people according to their identity, social class, their race, ethnicity, language, and so on, into what is acceptable for their future. She ends the chapter, by writing, the moral is clear. If we are to root out racism from the schools and introduce an awareness of ethnic diversity, we must recognize that we are engaged in what is historically a subversive task. Now, what is wrong with that rhetoric? To me, there's not much that's wrong with it. I think that she's really hitting the nail on the head by pointing out the inequities in our society and by also challenging teachers to become subversives in the best sense of the word. That is, to really challenge inequitable policies and practices in their classrooms and in their schools. She went on also to say that the tools that teachers have to work with are in this order of importance, in ascending order of importance. The curriculum, which can be an ally, but because curriculum is so messed up a lot of times, we have to change it. more important than the curriculum is the students, who they are, and how to really use who they are in the curriculum rather than dismiss who they are. And the most important is the teacher herself, because, and she points out how white ethnic teachers were either unaware or unwilling to look back on the cultural amnesia in this society and to look at what their own roots are. A lot of the work that Gary Howard has done is certainly about this. And so it was a transformative piece that I think said to me that there's nothing wrong with that old multicultural education, with the rhetoric at least. But if we want to build on the subversive task that is multicultural education, it means, for example, challenging this age-old deficit perspective that still rears its ugly head in almost every corner of teacher education, whether we wanted to or not. That we often have students who have had very little experience with diversity, either personally or in their own lives or in their experience, in their own identities or their experiences, and so they many times come to us with deficit perspectives. Not that it's their fault. They have been brought up in a system that, for example, has taught them with a monocultural curriculum and to view the world with one perspective, not with multiple perspectives. And so, we get students who believe that that there's still one right way of doing things, that it's okay to track students, and so what if all the black and brown students are in the lowest tracks? Well, that's just the way that it is. And who might think that speaking a language other than English is a real deficit. Poor kids, they don't speak English, rather than thinking, wow, how great, they speak whatever other language they speak. So that's that deficit perspective. Or, that their families are deficient because they don't come to school, to open school night, when we don't make schools very welcoming to them in the first place. And so all of these are examples of that deficit perspective. So that's what it means to challenge, to this deficit perspective, is turning these things on their head. I often cite the work of William Ryan, who wrote this wonderful book that most of you are too young to have read, but some of you I can tell, may have read, called Blaming the Victim. It came out in 1972. And he really turned this deficit perspective on its head and said that rather than blame the victim, we should start thinking about the schools to which we commit these children. Right? And what are we doing in those schools? That instead of culturally deprived children, maybe what we have are culturally depriving schools. And that language, I think, is very powerful. We can extend it to today and think about this language of, children at risk. What put them at risk in the first place? Or children with low self-esteem. Self-esteem is a tricky thing, Kids who have low self-esteem at school may be fine at home. They may be fine in their communities. It may be the school that is producing that low self-esteem. There's a wonderful quote from a girl in a dissertation of that a friend of mine did, where the girl said, why are teachers always talking about this low self-esteem? They're the ones who gave it to us in the first place. So that's one of the things that I think it means to really look at this rhetoric and change it. Another one is understanding that teacher education is a profoundly political endeavor. And it's a minefield of contestation and tension, because it responds to questions that get at the very heart of the purpose of education in a democratic and pluralistic society. So we can't escape the fact that education is always political, as Paulo Freire often reminded us, but that multicultural education is even more so, because it's challenging this, this question of who's an American and who has the right to claim that identity. So these are some of the questions that are at the very heart of the purpose of public education, like who deserves an excellent and high-quality education. We can say that everybody does, but then look at our schools. Look at our schools. Who gets the most money? Who gets the most experienced teachers? Who gets the best materials? You know, and you cannot then say that everybody deserves it. When you have kids who are, you know, one of the questions that I always ask people to think about is you know, what I call profoundly multicultural question. Where is the bilingual program? Is it in the basement? Is it under the staircase? Is it in one of the portables? And if it is, and you know, I ask these questions because very often the ELL program, the bilingual program, the special ed program, that's where these programs are. And there's always a reason. Oh, well, that's the latest program, we didn't have room for it. But I challenge you to find a gifted and talented program that's in the basement. That says something about the status of those programs. Also recognizing that the inequality in our society it's reflected and reproduced in schools, and it couldn't be otherwise unless we challenge that, right? There are some schools that are really challenging that, and that is saying just because we live in an unequal society doesn't mean that we have to have schools that reproduce this all the time. But schools are part of the general socio-political context, and we need to recognize that. We also need to always ask follow-phase questions, as I mentioned last night, of who benefits and who loses. Who benefits and who loses? I think those are always important questions to ask in anything, not just in education. How do certain policies and practices benefit some students over others, and what can we do about that? Understanding how we collude in reproducing inequality and trying to do something about it wherever we find ourselves. Many years ago, there was an organization called the Council on Interracial Books for Children. Some of you who are older may remember that. It was a wonderful organization that had a bulletin that came out a few times a year. And they had this bulletin, they had some, this is really dated, some film strips, right? They had film strips, they had, you know, a lot of educational materials that looked at racism and classism and other kinds of, you know, anti-human values is what they call them in schools. And they had a film strip of a superintendent of schools in New Jersey who was a very brave woman. And on this film strip, she identified herself as an anti-racist racist. So what did that mean? Well, that meant that even if she fought racism, because she tried to be anti-racist, she colluded in maintaining racism because of her very position, even though she didn't want to. So, for example, she had to give, in her district, she had to give tests that sorted students. She tried to do a lot of other things that would challenge these things, but she recognized that some students were benefiting because of the decisions that she had to make, or that she was put in a position to make. And that was a very, very courageous, I think, kind of statement that she made. It also means what Kristen has called creating communities of conscience for social justice. Not only moving beyond mouthing the words, because I have to say I am so tired of hearing people talk about social justice. I am so tired of wherever I go, well, you know, we all believe in social justice here. I know that you do here at Western, I'm not criticizing that. But I've just been in too many places where, you know, as they're, you know, I've had experience with this, not personal experience, but as they're firing someone or not giving tenure to someone, they do it in the name of social justice. Or hiring people, they do it in the name of social justice. Well, we couldn't find any other candidates, so everybody who they hire is white. But we're doing it in the name of social justice. And, you know, I'm just really tired of hearing that all the time. So I think that we need to go beyond mouthing the words, but doing so collectively and collaboratively, these you know, communities of conscience with like-minded peers. So, you know, something that I always encourage people to do is to make a friend. make a friend wherever you are, whether you're at the university, whether you're in a school, whatever setting that you're at, make a friend so that you can make a difference, because alone you can't do it. Or alone you shouldn't do it. We shouldn't have that model of just the hero who goes out and changes the world, because that is exhausting, and it doesn't last long. So I think that, people can work to change their classroom and their school, their district, their town, their city, the state, the nation, the world, It's limitless, but you have to do it with other people. And we have to also rethink superficial understandings of culture. For example, this rhetoric like, they don't value education because it's not part of their culture. I'm tired of hearing that. I have never met anybody who doesn't value education. They value education in different ways, and we have to learn how they value it, instead of, making our own assumptions about that. Or poor people need instant gratification. That's a very popular one, a la Ruby Payne. If she's gone to your school, this is a difference that you can make, is say, maybe we shouldn't be listening to people like that who come up with very superficial explanations of poverty. Poor people need instant gratification. I've never met people who need instant gratification more than middle class people, actually. So let's think about that, And I'm part of that middle class. Because these stereotypes just relieve teachers of their responsibility. Because they say, oh, well, that's part of their culture, we can't do anything about it. Instead of, let me try to understand their culture. Or always ask, is this cultural? Or is it me? And also to recognize that the problem is not only in the schools, because we've been focusing a lot on the schools, but it's also in the academy, at the university. And so, for example, asking who's qualified to teach for diversity. I've known of so many cases where somebody with a Latino name or with a black face comes into the university and, oh, you're the multicultural education professor, because you must know about it, even though they majored in teaching chemistry, for example, or just getting other people who are not qualified. So we have to look at the university as well. We have to look at the recruitment and retention policies for faculty so that we have a more diverse faculty in colleges of education and in universities. We have to look at tenure and promotion decisions. At UMass, for a few years, and I don't know if it's still this way, but part of the tenure and promotion decision, or the way that they looked at it, is that everybody had to write down in the 3 areas of scholarship, teaching, and service, how it added to our multicultural commitment at the university. That makes a statement. Not everybody was happy with that, but it does make a statement. I'm hoping that it did make a difference. I'm not sure, but at least it was there. So, I want to just say a few more things about what works. I think that we know what works. We just haven't really tried it. We really haven't. For example, restructuring schools to serve all students equitably. That is, who does tracking benefit? Who gets to influence policy in that area? It's not poor parents. It's not the parents whose kids are in the lower tracks. Who speaks the language of the students in the school? Do they have access to that language? In one article that was written years ago, 20 years ago, and I just love this, it was in the Harvard Ed Review, and it's called Promoting the Success of Latino Language Minority Students, an exploratory study of 6 high schools. And they looked at 6 high schools. The authors were Tamara Lucas, Rosemary Himes, and Ruben Donato. And they looked at these 6 schools and found that the professional development was really geared toward teachers learning about those students, was geared to teaching teachers Spanish, for example, that there was an incredible outreach in the community, and so on and so forth. These were schools that worked. So we know what works. Not that we should do more research, but we know a lot of things that work. And we need teacher education programs that challenge perspective and practicing teachers to recognize their privilege and their power. because all of us have power, whether we're in the academy or in schools. We need professional development that's meaningful and critical and rigorous. We need, for example, to promote teachers as intellectuals so that they see that their work is an intellectual endeavor and not just teaching students how to take tests, for example. And I just want to end with a little story of, by encouraging everybody to push themselves to think, what can I do? In the Affirmative Diversity Academy, I have little sections in each of the chapters, what you can do, because we think that it's not only the theory, but it has to be the practice. So, asking, what can I do alone with colleagues in my classroom and out, because it means becoming a multicultural person. And I just want to give a little example of that with the work of Mary Cowie, who some of you know, who's an early childhood educator and has a wonderful book called Black Ants and Buddhists. And it's a friend of Patty's and mine and studied with me at the university. When she was in my class in multicultural education, she came over to me near the end of the semester. She had done a project. I should mention Mary was very conversant with the civil rights movement. She was a community organizer for 14 years. She knew Black and Latino communities in the East very well, and she's a white woman herself. She was dedicated to doing this work. And when she took my class, she decided that she was going to do her research project on gay and lesbian issues, because that was an area that she didn't know very much about, and she really wanted to support all her students. So she did, and she came to me. She did a wonderful project, and she came to me towards the end of the semester and said, Sonia, I've decided that I'm going to do an action project based on the work that I did. Well, poor students who came after her, because then I decided that everybody should do an action project because it was so wonderful. And what she did was to determine all the actions that she would take as a teacher. And they were really wonderful, from showing it's elementary to doing professional development with her peers, to ordering books, children's books, to and so on. Taking pictures of every family in the school so that they line the walls as you walk in. And that alone says so much, because you are showing what's valued in that school. But the last thing, or the most courageous thing that they did, was to march as a school with the school banner in the Gay Pride March of the city. They're still the only school that does that. They started out with 3 or 4 people, adults, 3 or 4 kids, and now they have a large contingent that marches behind the Jackson Street School banner. So that is what it means to really think about reigniting, as we said the other day, and moving beyond the rhetoric. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. How many people here are either P-12 teachers or learning to be teachers? Just raise your hand. Okay, thanks. For the last 35 years or so, my work has been in educating teachers. So I'm going to address the question of the new multicultural education in terms of preparing teachers to teach everybody's children. And I'm going to try to make one point in my time allotted tonight. And my argument is that if we do this one thing that I'm calling for, a lot else will follow from it. And so I think it's one issue that I believe is central to the preparation of teachers in democratic and multicultural societies, the question of who should prepare teachers to do this important work, whose knowledge counts and should count in preparing teachers. And over the years, and this has been the substantial literature that's been accumulated in the United States and all over the world on questions of who should be prepared to be teachers in democratic societies and what that preparation should be like. I think I too am tired of hearing social justice, teacher education. We're doing it. And it's pretty hard to find a program in the world right now that does not claim to be doing social justice and multicultural teacher education. This literature has addressed issues related to admitting students to programs, recruiting students, the structure of the programs, the curriculum, the field experiences. A lot of attention has been given to questions about what kinds of school placements candidates should have, what kinds of readings they should be assigned, and so on. One question that's received very little explicit attention is who should prepare these teachers as multicultural and social justice educators, and whose knowledge and expertise should inform this preparation. Currently, despite all the specific varieties of teacher education in the United States, there are essentially two approaches. What I call early entry, where the preparation is completed while the person is on the job fully responsible for a classroom, and what's called college recommending, where most of the preparation is completed before somebody becomes responsible for a classroom. The traditional model, which is where 70 to 80% of teachers in the United States are still prepared in colleges and universities, emphasizes academic knowledge as the primary source of knowing for the learning of teacher candidates. Next slide, please. Candidates are supposed to learn what and how to teach on in their campus courses and go out and apply what is learned in schools during their field experiences. Very little success has been achieved generally in coordinating what's done on campus and in the field. Teachers in P12 with whom candidates are placed for their field placements often know very little about the campus-based part of the programs, and the campus instructors know very little usually about the placement sites, the work of the cooperating teachers, and the communities in which the schools exist. Even in this current era of school-university partnerships, professional development schools, partner schools, I would argue that colleges and universities can continue to try to maintain complete power over the construction and dissemination of knowledge for teaching in the education of teachers, and that schools remain in the position of what I call practice fields, where candidates are to try out the practices, the real knowledge that's provided to them from the universities. Now, although the reality of how teachers prepared is much more complex than I've just portrayed it, the way in which college and university-based teacher education is usually structured, in my view, is fundamentally undemocratic and elitist, and largely fails to strategically access knowledge and expertise that exists in schools and communities that could inform the preparation of teachers in important ways. Although prospective teachers spend a substantial amount of time in schools during their preparation, there is typically, across this country, very little planning for the use of that time, and very little effort to strategically access the knowledge that good teachers have in those schools. Next. There's only 4 slides, I promise. On the other hand, the rapidly expanding number of what are called early entry programs now that place candidates in schools with very little preparation. These programs emphasize and sometimes uncritically glorify practice and practitioner knowledge and minimize the importance of professional education coursework, which is not seen as directly connected to daily teaching practice. This kind of thinking leads to such things as the definition of social foundations content as a non-essential element in the preparation of teachers. This kind of thinking has also led to an inequitable distribution of teachers in many parts of the United States, where those with the least preparation are the most likely to be teaching children living in poverty. Now, in my view, neither of these two forms of teacher education typically give much attention to the role of community-based knowledge in preparing teachers. It is my belief that neither of these two stances toward a knowledge base for educating teachers, an emphasis on academic or practitioner knowledge to the exclusion of serious attention to other knowledge sources, is sufficient for preparing teachers to be successful in today's schools. Despite social justice-oriented rhetoric that is common in teacher education programs, the hidden curriculum of teacher education often sends a very clear message about the lack of respect for the knowledge of P12 educators and non-professional educators who live in communities and some of whom send their kids to schools in those communities. It is my belief, final slide, that the preparation of teachers for democratic and multicultural societies must be based on an epistemology or knowledge structure that is in itself democratic and includes a respect for and interaction among practitioner, academic, community-based knowledge. Our current Secretary of Education is very fond of saying that it takes a whole university to educate teachers. Now, although I agree with him that all university responsibility for the preparation of teachers is very important, and that arts and science faculty really need to be a central part of the education of teachers, or they are a central part, they need to recognize that they are. It takes much more than a whole university to educate teachers well. It is my strong belief that no one group, college or university faculty and staff, P-12 educators, or people who live in communities, and in some cases send their kids to those schools, has all the expertise that is needed. Whether this more democratic knowledge structure for educating teachers can even exist in universities, or whether it needs to be existing in newly created spaces with different knowledge histories, more neutral spaces, such as they've done in France recently, is an open question. What I have in mind is the creation of new hybrid spaces where academic, practitioner, and community-based knowledge come together in new, less hierarchical ways to support teacher learning. The concept of horizontal expertise, which depicts a mixing of expertise from different spheres of activity, is a useful tool for conceptualizing what I think is necessary. A more democratic political economy of knowledge that I believe, unless we're doing this, we truly can't say we're doing social justice work in teacher education. Horizontal expertise involves boundary crossing across schools, universities, and communities, and combining the expertise from different sources to achieve new hybrid solutions to the problems of educating teachers and kids. However, merely bringing people together from colleges and universities, schools, and communities to plan, deliver, and renew teacher education programs will not necessarily alter the way in which knowledge is utilized in the preparation of teachers, nor create the kind of social equality that I believe is needed. There is substantial evidence that traditional knowledge hierarchies are maintained even in situations that are alleged to be characterized by collaboration, such as professional development schools or partner schools. Jerry Duffy, who used to be in Washington at one point, had argues with regard to this school-university partnership movement that a non-egalitarian spirit, rather than a spirit of collaborative egalitarianism, has prevailed, where university academic knowledge continues to count more than the knowledge of elementary and secondary school teachers. He has claimed that in our eagerness to establish professional development schools and partnerships with schools, we have recreated a caste system under the slogan of collaboration, in which professors continue to try to position themselves as the experts and teachers as the followers. In his book, Like Stone Soup, Peter Morrell correctly points out that voices from the broader community are typically absent altogether from school-university partnerships. I recently discovered the work of Ray Oldenburg, who has analyzed the role of what he calls third places, such as cafes, coffee shops, bars, hair salons, in the building of community. Oldenburg discusses a concept I think is very useful called leveling, that describes situations where worldly status claims must be checked at the door and that all may be equals. This surrendering of outward status or leveling transforms those who own delivery trucks and those who drive them into equals. Oldenburg argues that whatever hint of hierarchy that exists is predicated on human decency and a concern for the common good, rather than on the arrogance of claiming to know everything, or on the selfishness that prevents individuals from looking beyond their own self-interest. Now, there are some examples in teacher education of efforts moving in this direction, and I'll be glad to describe them if there's an interest later. But there are none that I'm aware of in which academic, school-based, and community-based knowledge have been brought together over time in these new interinstitutional ways, in the ways that I envision. I started my career 35 years ago in the National Teacher Corps as a teacher educator. That program, which lasted from 1965 to 82, that involved substantial roles for communities, came the closest, but the implementation of that was very uneven across the country. What is needed, in my view, is a fundamental shift in whose expertise counts in the education of the next generation of teachers. It is no longer enough to have university academics alone framing the discourse and inviting school-based educators and people from the larger community to participate, in quotes, in a university-owned program or school-based teacher educators to shut out the potential contributions of university academics, as is happening as I speak all over this country. Given the labor-intensive nature of building these new kind of interinstitutional partnerships, the habits of those of us who live in each of these places, and the low status of teacher education in many universities across the country, it's going to be difficult to achieve this cultural shift in teacher education. How to achieve this shift is also going to be very complicated by the defunding of public universities across the United States, including in Washington. Public universities that continue, as I said earlier, to educate 70 to 80% of America's teachers are gradually being ripped of their state support. It is especially important in multicultural programs that claim to be preparing teachers to work for greater social justice that teacher educators model for their students a stance, epistemological stance and commitment to social equality within the teacher education process itself. That the same thing that we desire our students to go out and do in schools in relationship to respectful relationships with the communities that they're serving. Given the size of the teaching force in the United States, about 3.6 million teachers working in about 90,000 schools across this nation, it's abundantly clear that there need to be multiple pathways into the teaching profession in the United States. And it's also clear to me that schools and universities cannot solve our problems in teacher education without pooling, and communities cannot solve it without pooling expertise in the ways that I've been alluding to tonight, to create new, what I call hybrid solutions to these problems that draw on multiple forms of expertise. This is a very exciting but dangerous time for teacher education in the United States. There is both a real opportunity that I have not seen in my career to establish teaching as a true profession with high standards for those who teach everybody's children. There is also a danger, however, that teacher education will be dismantled into a purely market economy, divorced from universities, that can support the development of teachers who are able to exercise, who will be able to implement teaching scripts, but no more, who will not be equipped to adapt their expertise on an ongoing basis to meet the needs of their students. And these people right now are the most likely to be teaching, quote unquote, other people's children. Not the policymakers who are making these policies, but we have a very inequitable distribution of teachers in the United States. The future of this democratic nation will largely depend on the fate of our public schools. And the future of teacher education's contribution to building and maintaining good public schools for everybody's children will depend on all of us involved in teacher education to look beyond our own self-interest and learn how to do things in ways that we have never done them before. It is my view that what I've discussed tonight is the central issue in the new multicultural teacher education. Thank you.
Is there lights? Well, good evening. Again, my name is Denny Hurtado. My Indian name is Takshmi Ashton. I'm from the Skokomish Nation, right across southwest here in the Olympic Mountains. First, I would like to thank the Lummi Nation for allowing me to speak on their traditional lands and territories. For those that don't know this, that you're on lands that used to belong to the Lummi Nation, and they were given up in treaties that were negotiated in 1855 with then Governor Stevens. And so, I'm a person, I talk about I'm a product of the teacher corps too, myself. That's how I became a teacher. And became an administrator. Now I'm the Indian Ed Director for the state of Washington. And like Kristen said before, I'm now a recovered tribal chairman. So, for those of you that don't know about tribal politics, it's probably one of the most fierce politics in the world, and we have to deal with that daily. And our communities on the reservation are a lot different than any other community in the world. So you have to keep that in mind when you're thinking about educating our students, because we have different needs. I'm not against multicultural ed, but for us as Indian educators, we are very clear and specific about the fact that our needs are really different than other students in this country because of our treaties that were negotiated back in 1855. I would also like to acknowledge one of my mentors who was a professor here, Dr. Bill Dimmer, who passed this last year. And so, I want to continue the work that he started, which was focused on culturally based education systems for our students in our schools. And we know that these systems work for our students, but it seems like the powers that be don't believe us. I mean, we've been talking about this since 1926 in the Merriam report that came out. And we're still talking to this day some of the very same issues that were talked about back then. And so, like Sonia said, we know what works. We know we don't really need to do a lot more research. We just need to get to the work at hand. And for me, when I talk about working out in the school systems and with our tribes and our communities, it's really about relationships. I'm a firm believer in relationships. Everything I do in my life is around relationships. My relationship to this earth, my relationship with my family, my kids, my grandkids, my community, my relationship that I have with my coworkers at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, or with the National Indian Education Association Board, which I am a board member. And so it's really, it's not really rocket science. I just don't get it. It's about relationships, love, and care. I mean, we host a youth leadership summit every year, and I've always asked our students, well, what's your definition of a good teacher? And it's never about the content. It's always about the heart. It's always about the students saying, well, this teacher really cares about me and understands where I'm coming from, where I'm at with my academics, where I'm at with my home life. That's what it's about. And once students see that, once they connect and have that relationship with that teacher, then that trust comes. And with trust comes a lot of stuff. Those students are going to trust you and believe in you, and so they're going to want to help you as well. So it's really about relationships. Everything we do in our life is about relationships. If you don't have a good relationship with your mother, what happens? If you don't have a good relationship with your wife, what happens? So it's really forging those relationships with our tribal communities, because how many people here, hopefully if you read that document I gave you, it's kind of ironic that I'm the one that cut all the trees down to give you information about what we're doing in the state and the nation, but I felt that you needed to understand where we're coming from, because a lot of people don't know who we are as a people, or as a government for that matter. And we are very distinct in that ways, because we do have a federal relationship with the federal government, and that through via this our treaties. There's 550 nations, tribal nations in this country. How many tribes in Washington State? I go do professional development training to social studies teachers and history teachers. These are bright people, and I ask them one simple question. How many tribes in Washington State? And of the hundreds of teachers that I've asked this question, not one could answer that simple question. Now, what's wrong with that picture? The thing that's wrong with that is that we're invisible from this whole process. We have been invisible. Our kids are invisible in the classroom unless it's a tribal school or a school that has a large majority of Native American students. It's like we're not there, and our kids are feeling this. And so we need to be cognizant about that fact. You have to know that our history does impact how we view education, because of the boarding school system that we my grandparents and my great-grandparents and my parents had to go to these boarding schools. These aren't boarding schools that the rich send their kids to. These were the boarding schools in 1887 by Colonel Pratt that was a method of not having to kill all the Indians. Maybe we can just brainwash them all. And so tribes are still thinking that's the way the system is. It's a assimilation model. And we're against that. We are pushing for our culture, our language, our history, and our government to be taught in the school system. And the reason why we do that is because we want to better educate our citizens about who we really are as a people. Not what you see in Hollywood, not what you hear on Columbus Day or Thanksgiving. We don't like seeing kids dressed up as little Indians dancing around, as little Indian kids. It disrespects us. This whole issue of mascots is a hot issue for tribal communities, Nowhere else, no other race has to deal with that. Just natives. Why is that? So our history does impact how we view education. And so the push for our people is to really focus on culturally based education systems. And we know that works. The work that Dr. Dimmert has been doing, we've been doing it for about 7 years, and we're starting to get data to be able to prove to the feds, because they always want this, they want a quasi-experimental design research project, and it's got to be, research-based and all this, and they never really give us the money or the effort to really do it, because they know that we're right. We know that our kids do better in that environment when they're learning about who they are and where they come from. A good example is the journey, which is called the journey. It's the canoe paddles that were brought back here to our Washington State in 1989. And from 10 canoes back in 89, now we're looking at probably 110 canoes that come to one reservation and celebrate our culture, our language, our history. And so the students are immersed in that. And they're looking for something to identify with and with whom. Because we have a saying that our people are kind of lost right now because we don't have our full culture language and we don't know our history. And so that's what the tribes are really pushing, is to gain all that back as much as we can. It's not our fault that we can't speak our language for those of us who can't speak it. Because if you spoke your language in these boarding schools, they would wash your mouth out with soap. We hear these stories over and over again of what happened in these schools. This is where all these dysfunctional stuff came to our communities, started from those boarding schools. In those boarding schools, our people were molested, abused, murdered, killed, and we're not going to forget it. We're not going to blame you, but we expect you to understand the truth. That's what the reality is. I heard a saying where the rhetoric becomes a reality. Well, that's a reality for us. And that's not that far removed to hear those stories coming from your own family and saying, whoa. And then when we do professional development around the state to teachers, they're flabbergasted because they can't believe that the government did this to us. See, you don't know what's happened to us. You're not being taught that. It's very intentional to keep all that history out of the books because it's not a very nice history. In the beginning it was because there was more of us. They had to deal with us. But, through time, through wars, through disease, our populations were decimated. And I have to go around this country and remind these big-time organizations like ETS and College Board and these organizations, they talk about academic achievement of minority students and Native Americans are never up there. And so now after 10 years of talking, I start to see that we're included in the picture and we're no longer invisible. And that's important. That's very important. How would you feel? You put yourself in those shoes. And really, if you're going to talk about, bias and stereotypes and that, you really have to look at yourself first. That's where it starts. Each and every one of you, if you're going to become a teacher, before you can teach our kids, you're going to have to look into yourselves and say, well, what do I think of Indians? What do I know of Indians? Who are they? What are they? What do they do? Nobody knows anything about us. You know, you all think we ride horses and live in teepees. No, in Washington we have canoes and live in longhouses. Our clothing is made out of cedar. You know, I taught in Shelton High School in between two reservations. Every kid in my class always asked me if I had a teepee or rode a horse. And I had to tell them, no, we're all different. And so that's something you have to understand. Just because you learn about one tribe doesn't mean you know everything about every other tribe in the country, because we're all distinct and different and unique. And so that's why I really think, you know, if you really want to, the reason why I really focus on relationships, because in my life, in my journey, I've seen where I've developed relationships with key people, legislators, you know, people at ETS, College Board, you know, around the country. I serve on College Spark Foundation. Once you develop that relationship with those people and they understand, you start educating them, then things really start to happen. You start to partner, you start to collaborate, and then things get better for the kids. And that's really where the focus is about our kids, because you know, our dropout rates are horrendous. On my reservation, it's 90%. You know, anywhere in the country, that would be unacceptable. And a lot of Indian reservations in the country, the dropout rates ranges from 40 to 90%. You know? And to me, I think that so those Indian kids are some of our strongest leaders, but they're saying, hey, if I have to pick between my culture or this school, that's where our kids are going to go, over here. They're not even going to think about it. You know, the Mohawks have a great model, is the Akwesasne Freedom School in New York City. New York State. And their philosophy is they have a 200% education model. They really believe this. 100% full Mohawk. Language, culture, history, tradition, government. And then 100% public academia. And they have been able to merge those two things together. They don't accept any public money, any federal, state money. They just go out and do it themselves. And about 95% of their students go on to college and graduate from college and are fluent in their language. Same with Jemez Pueblo Charter School. They're doing the same thing. So we know it works. We know that's good for our communities and our students. So that's our whole focus is behind culturally based education systems. I'm going to read you something that for the first time in our history, that the National Congress of American Indians, who is made up of all the tribal leaders across the nation, along with the National Indian Education Association, came up with the National Tribal Priorities for Indian Education. You guys have a copy of this. This is what we gave you. But the one thing I want to read is to show that because we're distinct and different, because of our treaties, we have laws. There's more laws about Indian people than any other race in the world. We have umpteen laws about us as a people. And so I'm going to read this. And this can kind of explain why we really don't want to fit in that multicultural model, because we are distinct. We have our own lands. We control our own peoples. We manage our resources. We do all that as a nation, as a government. And that's why it's important that you understand that when we deal with people in our country as tribes, we're dealing as a government to government, on a government to government basis. And so I'm going to read this, and well, before I read this, I want to let you know that because I understand and we've seen all the issues and concerns and problems, we always come from it at a point of view that we look at our children as they're all gifted and talented. Every child is gifted and talented. If you can't say that, then you don't need to be in the education field. Point blank. Because everyone has a gift. Who are we to say that that kid isn't gifted and talented? And that's the purpose of our document that we came up. There's 4 or 5 studies that came out this last year through the legislature. And it was for each 5 groups to do some research on academic achievement of their students. And so all these studies are within each of your commissions. So there's a study on the Latinos, there's one on African Americans, there's one on Pacific Islanders, there's one on Native Americans, and then there's one on Asians. And so ours is called From Where the Sun Rises. It's a very comprehensive document that talks about what do we need to better to raise the academic achievement gap of our students. So that's on the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs website. You can Google Goya, G-O-I-A, and just look for that document that says From Where the Sun Rises. There's also a new report on higher ed. It's called Pathways through the Evergreen State College. You can go to Evergreen's website and get that document. That's the most up-to-date, comprehensive document of what's happening in the universities in Washington State around Native Americans. So those two documents, if you're really thinking about working with Native communities, you need to read those two documents as well. So I'm going to read this, and how much time have I got? I've seen Sonia took 30 minutes, so I can have 30. I'm just kidding, Sonia. But because, you know, I see the problems and the issues, I'm not about blaming or, you know, pointing. I'm about finding solutions to the problem. You know, and that's where I come from, finding those solutions. So one of my solutions, or our solution in the tribal community, the Tribal Leaders Congress, John McCoy, who's the Tulalip tribal member that helped get this bill passed, our solution was to start development of tribal sovereignty curriculum for the state of Washington. So we're going to go live August of this year. It's a web-based curriculum, and it's for grades 4 through 12. And it's designed in a way to be integrated into existing content, you know, because if you did a standalone curriculum on tribal sovereignty, where do you think it would stay? On the shelf. So we designed it in a way to where it's 3 levels, level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1, you guys could do. You know, we make it easy for the teachers to do it. Level 2 gets a little harder. Level 3 could be a whole semester, a whole year, whatever you want to do, senior project. And then it's designed to be integrated into existing content. So in for elementary school, you could integrate it into social studies. For middle school, you could integrate it into Washington State history, and for high school, you could integrate it into U.S. history and world contemporary problems. And so that's kind of how we're designing it. And we have the State Board of Education behind us. We have the Washington State School Directors Association, which are all the school boards in Washington State. We have our office, OSPI, behind it, and then we have all 29 tribes behind it, and the MOUs in your packet as well. So, you know, it's really about educating all citizens about who we are, so it breaks down those stereotypes, those misconceptions about who we are as Indian people. Because I remember when the Bolt decision was passed, racism was very alive and well, especially against Indian people. You know, there was bumper stickers that said, "Save a salmon, kill an Indian." It's 1975, what the heck? When the macaws got their whale, same thing happened again. Save a whale, kill a macaw. You know, we got to get rid of all this hate, you know. We're human beings, we got to love each other. That's where it's at. You know, until we do that, then we're going to continue to battle each other, you know, and we will if we have to. You know, we have for 500 years, you know. And so, but I'm about relationships, I'm about partnerships, I'm about finding solutions to help with problems, and that's where I come from. So I'm going to close with this statement that is a joint policy statement by the National Congress of American Indians and the National Indian Education Association. We must be clear, specifically addressing the needs of American Indians and Alaskan Natives, Native Hawaiians, within the reauthorization of ESEA. This is an important year for education because this is the reauthorization of ESEA, which drives all of education in the nation. So reauthorization of ESEA is not akin to providing requirements for reducing education disparities or considering the needs of ethnically diverse populations. While we may fall into those target populations as well, the significant difference is that providing education to American Indian, Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiians is a federal obligation. And because of our unique legal status as Indian people. When tribes ceded lands which now constitute the United States, agreements were made between tribes and the United States government that establish a trust responsibility for the safety and well-being of Indian peoples in perpetuity. In addition, a number of treaties specifically outline that provisions of education, nutrition, and health care. Therefore, the federal trust responsibility for American Indians and Alaska Native education must be recognized in all education policies. So that's the distinction between us. It's because of our treaties, because we have land, because we have resources, and we still govern our own people. And so we deal on a government-to-government basis. The key is don't do it to us, but do it with us. You know, that's really the key for any community where you're at. If we're going to a Latino community, a black community, Asian, whatever community, you do it with them, not to them. And that's the thing that we need to really think about, is that that's the only way it's going to work, is if we do it together. You know, because we know our needs. You can't do it without us. We can't do it without you. We have to do it together. And so really, that's really the issue, is really developing these relationships, these partnerships, and these collaborations. So that's it for me. So thank you.
Marilyn Cochran-Smith brought up the idea of interrogating the multiple meanings of multicultural teacher education. And I'm also going to follow up on a question we've heard a few times tonight about what counts as knowledge. Do it over here because I'm so short behind the podium. So, Marilyn Cochran-Smith talks about the knowledge question. She talks about the knowledge question, and we've discussed the knowledge question quite a bit in multicultural education. James Banks includes knowledge construction as one of the 5 dimensions of multicultural education, and I embrace and support definitions of multicultural education to help move us forward to look at the authenticity of our practices as well as our theories. Sonia, of course, includes critical pedagogy and really looking at student knowledge and teacher knowledge is one of the 7 characteristics, and Norma Gonzalez and Luis Moll and Kathy Monti talk about funds of knowledge, and many more theorists have brought up what counts as knowledge and the centrality of student knowledge when we're talking about this. So I want to talk for just a few minutes about classroom knowledge and student cultural knowledge, which we hear a great deal about, and which I completely agree exist as separate entities. And I also assert that we construct an oversimplified binary about those, an oversimplified split. And while I'm saying this, I don't want to be misunderstood. I completely support and assert and advance and try to engage my students in community knowledge and understanding their own community knowledge and their separation from the knowledge of the communities they sometimes teach in, and figuring out how to connect those. At the same time, I'd like to look at one example, following up actually on Denny's comments about indigenous communities, and when we, those of us who are not part of tribal communities, entering tribal communities. So there's a photograph of me with Delphine, who is the head shaman, inviting me to participate in the Sequoian community, which is a community in Ecuador in the Amazon rainforest, in an area that at the time was accessible only by canoe. And I talk about this in an article that's a chapter that's in this book. And I talk about it in terms of a circulatory system, which helps me imagine knowledge in a different way. Instead of a split binary, a horizontal either or, I really am trying to create a way of thinking about student knowledge and community knowledge and teacher knowledge, and Ken talked about academic knowledge in the university and school knowledge and community knowledge, those 3, thinking about it, oxygenating that whole thing so that the knowledge is really the heart, and we have a circulatory system flowing through it where we're all affecting one another. As Denny just said, this is all about relationships, and we are affecting one another. So that's my general visual for you to imagine this. And I use the circulatory system because of the centrality of it, but because also I like to continue to build on some things Denny helped us think about when he talked about our relationship with the earth, because I want us to think about the arteries and veins of the earth as our waterways and rivers, as well as in our bodies, and what happens with the waterways and rivers when they are contaminated and they are circulating through the earth and also in our bodies. And then I would like you to imagine the arteries and veins of Eveline, who's the granddaughter of the head shaman, who's in the painting there, a portrait I did with her, and her arteries and veins, because she is living in a space where Chevron Texaco has contaminated the water for the past 35 years. So what I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes on when we're thinking about knowledge and how that knowledge comes to us. Why is Eveline's situation invisible to us? Why is the indigenous knowledge there not honored? Why is it that Chevron Texaco gets away with what's happening to the Sequoian community and the Kofan community? Has to do with these bigger macro questions that Sonia brought up and Ken brought up about how we deal with knowledge in teacher education and what knowledge counts. So I'd like to also bring us into the centrality in 2010 for our students, not only of their own community knowledge and community experience, but also of this question of what counts as knowledge and what gets sanctioned as knowledge. And looking at visual culture and popular culture and the intersection of that with academic knowledge and academic achievements. I'm going to try to tie all this together in my next 5 minutes, right? Watching my time here. 10 minutes. Okay, so to do this, I'd like you to participate in a little bit of visual culture engagement with me. I'm going to show you 2 brief videos. The first one is 6 minutes. And I don't know if we'll do the whole thing. We'll probably just do a couple minutes of it to give you a taste of it. And while you see this video in a moment, hang on, Delina, for a second, thanks. I'd like you to think about the intersection of scholarly research and academia and school knowledge and school achievement with popular culture. And how is knowledge shaped in our society today? And what can we do about bringing that knowledge front and center in a frame that's anti-racist and in a frame that's bringing all our students to achievement. Because the reason I was in Ecuador was because some students who I taught in kindergarten, first, second, and third grade, and eventually I taught them in middle school because I was an art teacher, so I got to teach kids for large chunks of their lives. Those kids read about the situation of the Sequoian people in a newspaper article. And they eventually created a solidarity relationship to fight the oil contamination, working for the attorneys who were fighting the lawsuit, and eventually started an NGO and worked in collaboration with Delphine, the head shaman, who you just saw. And those kids brought me to Ecuador. You gotta know, I'm a person who never went camping, by the way. So, because of the kids I taught in kindergarten, right, who read something in a newspaper and then saw something on a video and then made their own videos, I was engaged, they're more engaged, and hopefully the world is changing, maybe not as fast as we need it to. So this is Justicia Now, which is free online by Mo Films Productions. Anybody, you can find it, you can go find it online, made by these filmmakers. So I'd like you to see a little bit of this, and we're going to also look at another video, which I think you'll recognize. This one is less mainstream in the popular press. Want to help us out, Helena? Thanks. I'll take 1 second. There you go.
A lawsuit against Chevron Texaco, who bought Texaco in 2001, was filed in Ecuadorian courts on behalf of 30,000 indigenous and campesino people. The allegations charge the company with damaging the environment and the health of the communities in the area. Chevron Texaco denies any responsibility in this ecological catastrophe.
Fuerte compañeros, fuerte claros, se vive, se siente, la Amazonía está presente, se vive, se siente, la Amazonía está presente.
As I was filming these protesters, this woman's speech suddenly jumped out at me and kind of stopped me in my tracks. I didn't speak Spanish, but I didn't need to understand that she was communicating absolute desperation, and the passion in her voice was unlike anything I'd ever encountered.
Señores, ¿por qué no se ponen la mano en el pecho, señores de Texaco, y dicen basta, aquí se termina el juicio y vamos a ayudar a las personas que sufren con el cáncer?
If you look at the negative impact of the Industrial Revolution, and if you put it into the framework of a bomb, this would be ground zero. Someone has called this the rainforest Chernobyl. And we're still trying to get exact figures, but it's somewhere, 3 times the amount of oil that's been dumped here that was dumped in the Exxon Valdez spill. So it's the worst oil contamination in history. And it's an area the size of Rhode Island that used to be paradise. I mean, that's the tragedy of this. It used to be paradise, where just life was everywhere, abundant. And now it's toxic.
No va a vivir ya. Esto es las consecuencias del genocidio de la Texaco. ¿Sí? Ellos nunca dicen que no hicieron nada.
We're in a very, very intense battle with Texaco right now because they know we're finishing. They're trying to destroy the entire process. They're trying to destroy the credibility of the judge, the court, the experts, the evidence. The evidence is overwhelming against them. It's probably been the most litigated case in world history.
Hemos hecho 45 inspecciones judiciales a las áreas que operó Texaco, y en todos los sitios inspeccionados hemos encontrado abundante cantidad de productos tóxicos dejados por Texaco, que son cancerígenos. Dicen que la gente se enferma, que es porque no se lava las manos antes de comer, que es porque no hierve el agua para tomársela, pero que no es por el petróleo. Por Dios, ¿cómo quieren tapar un crimen culpando a los campesinos mismos de sus problemas de salud?
Near Texaco's wells, leukemia rates are 4 times as high as the national average. There's one community, San Carlos, there's been over 8 kinds of cancer found among the population who live there. These are communities who lived off the rivers and the streams and the groundwater.
Estamos en una piscina ya remediada por la Texaco.
So we're standing now on a remediated or supposedly cleaned up, well site.
Pero entre comillas, nomás porque les ha faltado tapar bien aquí.
And you have to say remediated in quotes because as you're going to see
no
here,
tapado bien. Yo quisiera que
they just covered it up. They didn't really clean it.
Still just smells exactly like crude oil.
There's entire villages, entire peoples that have been completely wiped out, like don't exist anymore. Everybody has died. Everything that they live on and off is poisoned.
Nosotros no queremos quedar en laguna de la contaminación, queremos salir de la contaminación para poder sobrevivir, porque si no vamos a terminar muertos.
So you can go online and find the rest of it. It's a few more minutes of it. But in the sake of time, I just wanted to point out on the previous slide, I had some images of some book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which is a book in the popular press and was also made into a movie. And he talks, John Perkins, who wrote the book, talks about the corporatocracy, which is the collusion of the government and global capitalism to allow this to happen, and the legislative process. And so I'd like you to consider that compared to Chevron's response, all the while keeping in the foreground our question for the night, which is beyond the rhetoric in multicultural education, and what counts as knowledge. What's happening with out-of-school knowledge that our students are consuming? What's happening with images of indigenous people or not? Images of urban communities? The visual culture, the messaging of visual culture, sociologists are telling us that our youth are consuming 80,000 times more visual imagery than printed text. Like it or not, it's happening. What counts as knowledge? How is it being propagated, and how is it being critiqued, consumed, and produced? So let's, can you help us, Melina? This is 2 minutes.
And outside, the debate rages. Oil, energy, the environment. It is the story of our time, and it is definitive and all-encompassing, and it leaves no one untouched. Because make no mistake, this isn't just about oil companies. This is about you and me, and the undeniable truth that at this moment there are 6.5 billion people on this planet. And by year's end, there'll be another 73 million. And every one of us will need energy to live. Where will it come from? This is our challenge each day. Because for today and tomorrow and the foreseeable future, our lives demand oil. But what's also true is that we can provide it more intelligently, more efficiently, more respectfully. That we'll never stop looking for alternatives. That an oil company can practice and espouse conservation. Yes, we are an oil company, but right now we're also providing natural gas, solar, hydrogen, geothermal. Because we live on this planet too. This is who we are, in 180 countries. Not corporate titans, but men and women of vision. 58,000 citizens of the world, liberals and conservatives, engineers and scientists, pipeline welders and geologists, husbands and wives, part-time poets and coaches, people who daily try to find newer ways, cleaner ways to power the world. Humans have always reached for what seemed impossible, because it is then that we find a way. Tell us it can't be done. Then watch as we tap the greatest source of energy in the world. Ourselves. This is the power of human energy.
Brings a tear to your eye, doesn't it? Did you see any indigenous people, any tribal communities? Who did we see? In what frame did we see them? What is the message? When did we see this? Has anybody seen these? There's a whole series of these. The Human Energy series they've poured millions of dollars into. Have you seen these before on TV? Raise your hand if you've seen them or heard them. During football games is a big time when they're shown. Something to think about. Have you ever seen Justicia Now? How many people before tonight knew about the Sequoia people? Oh, not very many. So let's go to the next slide. So the question is, in the role of popular culture and visual culture intersected with academic knowledge in the bigger question about what counts as knowledge is something that I think will help us move beyond the rhetoric. 60 Minutes has also done a really powerful piece on this, and they highlight Pablo Fajardo, who we saw speaking, the Ecuadorian lawyer. So you can look that up online. Pablo Fajardo was also awarded, CNN awarded him the Hero Award. Jimmy Smith gave it to him on TV. Vanity Fair did a cover story on him in 2007. So we see the power of popular culture bringing the attention of people, and especially our youth, to these situations in ways that school-based knowledge is not. And we need to think about harnessing that. Let's go to the next one quickly. There's a full-length feature documentary created by Joe Berlinger, who's an award-winning filmmaker, and this was a Sundance Award winner, so you can look that up as well. And that film, Crude, was actually created with the people I was with, and you really hear the voices of the Sequoia people. But let's move on. In terms of just wrapping up our theme for tonight about moving beyond the rhetoric, I've worked with Sonia in other work with our colleagues Eugenie Kang and John Rabel about proposing that we reconsider how we talk about identity, power, and inequality. And one of the ways I assert we do that is by reinventing the way we frame knowledge and come to understand these connections and these relationships in a globalized sense. So then, I think it's the last slide. James Banks has talked a lot lately about globalization and multicultural education, and I'm doing some work thinking about power, knowledge, and information criticality. So I'd just like to leave us with thinking about re-examining, re-engaging visual culture, popular culture, and the unsanctioned form of knowledge, and how we bring that into this circulatory system of the academy, the communities, the schools, in ways that will move us, drawing upon the roots of radical, critical, multicultural education, and move us forward. Thank you.
Stage is clearing. Fun to be last. All right. Thank you for the previous speakers, really, and also thank you to the audience. You've been wonderful. You've been very patient. Could we have more light up here in the front, too, for me? Thank you. Thank you. I don't really read from notes, but it makes it look like I am doing it. So what I'd like to do is and try to be really brief, because we're kind of getting into the question time. Thank you for your patience. Wonderful comments, all of these put together as a picture. I just want to start with this beautiful sunset out here, thanking Western, because really this all came together for me in 1978 at Western when I was getting my master's degree. Some of you, that was a long time ago. Some of you weren't born then. Some of your parents might not have been born then, I'm not sure. Also a product of Teacher Corps. There was a wonderful Teacher Corps project right here at Western that was housed in a little community called Arlington down the road here. And it was that embedded kind of teacher education. And they drew people that had passion for teaching, but we knew nothing about it. And with the collaboration of Western and the school district, so the school-based teacher knowledge, the community-based knowledge was basically focused on rural poverty, and the knowledge of the campus, really, I think, educating us is a wonderful way to be teachers. But what happened for me was that I got a sense of how social justice and my work in the civil rights movement could actually be connected to education, because I couldn't hook those up. I was, in a way, having trouble hooking up a lot of things because I was recovering from the 60s in a way. But so hooking things up was a little difficult, and Western helped me with that intellectually, to find a way to actually think of the work that I'd done in New Haven, Connecticut, and other places in the civil rights movement in the 60s, and hadn't really connected that to education, which was a strange thing. But really, a guy who spent his whole life in multicultural education, I had not hooked that up until I started looking at these concepts, and that was Carl Grant's theory, because Teacher Corps was a lot around Carl Grant's work on education that is multicultural in those early days. And I agree with Sonia that the rhetoric, the things we were talking about then still have meaning now. The problem with multicultural education is that the concepts and the language got hijacked. They got hijacked by an agenda that was basically dominant cultural agenda. So that multicultural education from a social justice, transformative, challenging white dominance, say, point of view, actually became adding a little difference to the curriculum. So it became, you talk to a lot of teachers today, they think of multicultural education as a curriculum inclusion thing, and that's where they stop. I work in schools all over the country. That's what I do now. I work in schools, doing teacher in-service mostly. I also get to come to campuses once in a while, and I love that as well. But mostly working with practicing teachers out there in the world under the onslaught of No Child Left Behind and adequate yearly progress and having their schools restructured and shut down. And once again, school reform means punishing the most already hurting schools. Let's punish them a little more. That's basically what has happened with that particular reform movement. Not that I don't believe in the fact that we have to disaggregate data and look at how we're not serving populations of kids. Wonderful idea. No Child Left Behind. Great idea. Marion Wright Edelman's idea, not George W. Bush's idea. George W. Bush took the thing, hers was the active voice, leave No Child Behind. Bush and his folks took it, made it in a passive voice. There's a clue there. No Child Left Behind. And then we went on with the policy. So the thing I want to say, though, is that the language has been hijacked. And so the work I do in schools, I think now, not just me, but other people, is actually reclaiming, in many ways, the vision that we have. Because people hear diversity, a lot of people out in the world think diversity is something you go to. Like a workshop. I was just doing a workshop in one of the many places I've been traveling recently, and there's a big sign outside the door that said, Gary Howard Diversity Training. And so I spent the first half hour digging myself out of that hole. Because I said, whatever you think diversity training is, this is not it. Right? Because you all have images of that. You've already been to that 13 times at least. And you got to feel blamed, beat up, felt guilty, or you got to be the victim, and who wants to do that? So we're going to do it one more time. And a lot of people have that in their heads still, that that's what this work is about. So I think part of it is reclaiming our language. So I think we've made that case tonight, reclaiming the language for the sake of the 21st century work. I want to share with you 3 words that I've found helpful for me in doing the work in schools. And my way is not the only way. It's just one way. It's how I'm struggling with it. And so rather than using actually multicultural and diversity, because that's been so hijacked, you've got to dig yourself out of so many historical holes with that language, I usually come in with 3 different words, and people can take these and mess them up too. But it's helping me in the work. So I just give them to you in your practice, in your teaching. And the words are inclusion, equity, and excellence. Those are the 3 words I've been working with a lot, asking people to think about those words. Because inclusion means people feel welcomed with their difference. They feel in some ways seen. They feel in some ways respected. Danny Hurtado's comments about just understanding who Native people are in their unique relationship. That's what we talk about inclusion, just feeling like you're actually there and somebody notices. For students, that's critical. You're there and some adult gets it that you're here, and they actually get it a little bit about who you are. That's an amazing thing, right? To have that experience as a gift. It's a luxury, unfortunately, for a lot of kids, as well as adults. So inclusion means that welcoming environment. A lot of it, Sonia, a lot of the writing we do is about creating those kind of environments where people feel they can bring most of their self in to that setting. So that's inclusion. There's a whole world of work right there. Equity is a lot of what we measure. Equity, I like to think about as the numbers, the measurements. This is where disaggregating data by race and gender and by special needs and by language diversity and poverty. This is why it's important that we have our data disaggregated. One of the problems in France, when they have the huge racist reaction against the multiculturalizing of France that's going on, is they don't even count their data by race. So how can you prove that you're having disproportionate hiring of, say, North African folks when you don't even look at the data? That's the ultimate act of social dominance, is rendering people invisible. You don't even get to look at the data. Some people say we overdo that. We document everybody by race and ethnicity. It's important to do that, to look at the equity outcomes across those differences. So in schools, those of you that are school people, we do pay a lot of attention to our outcomes around equity. But we should not only look at the ones that we're required to measure, but the ones like learning style. How are your kids doing across learning style? No Child Left Behind and AYP didn't ask us to measure that, but it's critical to look at your students by learning style. That's the artistic voice, right? How many of our kids are we missing, like Gary Howard did my first years of teaching? Western didn't give me this stuff in 1976 on learning style, let me tell you. Okay? So I'm teaching every kid like I learned because it got me to Yale, right? So it got me to Yale, I'm going to teach you the way I learned. In my rural, poverty, low income, hardly anybody in my classroom's parents graduated from high school, let alone college at that time. Gary Howard's learning style did not cut it with most of my kids. So I had to learn how to teach a totally different way than I like to learn, right? So that's another one. Just equity is those things. Equity is about the outcomes. Who's getting it, who's not. And what are the diversities involved in that? What are the diverse identities that we can see when we disaggregate that data? Equity is key. Don't let people just rob that one from us too and hijack that word. It's very important that we have that data. Excellence agenda is that we don't forget what our work is really about. For me, the excellence agenda is that we're educating human beings for effective living in the context, as we saw here. It's indigenous context, it's an inner city context, a rural context. We're educating, basically, to me, a multicultural global community context, pluralistic democracy context. Excellence is to remember why we teach. Most teachers, I think, go into teaching with some kind of vision of that, why we want to teach. What we get into often is a kind of cynical approach because we get so beat up in the process. A lot of teachers I see out there in the world have been significantly beat up in their own psyches and hearts about their work. It doesn't mean they're bad people, but they've lost it. They've lost it. And how do you redo the passion when the passion left? Right? That's a lot of what we're working with in public schools, I think, today. So equity is what we measure. Excellence is really the larger agenda of education. These get messed up because if you look at the U.S. News and World Report, December, every year they put out the best 100 high schools in America. I got it right here. This year's version, last December. 100 best high schools in America. So these should be the excellent schools, right? These should be the excellent schools. I decided to look at the list. Top school on the list, Thomas Jefferson High School, Alexandria, Virginia, always there at the top. Guess what the minority enrollment is the word they use. Kids of color enrollment at that high school. Guess what it is? 4.9%. 4.9%. So first of all, America's not showing up in this American high school. All right? The other one is poverty. Guess the poverty percentage at Thomas Jefferson High School. 1.3. Guess how you get into Thomas Jefferson High School? By application. Guess what the measurement is of excellence? Getting kids ready for college. You basically interview kids when they're freshmen. They're already ready for college, predestined for college. You have them 4 years, and by God, they go to college. What did you do? What did you do? I mean, this is not excellence. Talk about rhetoric. This is hijacking the excellence agenda. To me, excellence, and I went through the whole list of 100 schools, and I put a criteria on it. You had to have 25% kids of color. That's low. The country, most schools have over half. I mean, the country's going to be flip-flopping 2027, 2023. 0 to 18 is going to be all kids of color. Majority kids of color, 0 to 18. The country's going to flip somewhere in 2040. The Tea Party people know that. Okay? So basically, 25% is giving folks a break. You've got 25% kids of color, and you should have 25% poverty, because poverty, we measured officially about 20%, but that's a family of 4 with $19,500. Some of you working, some of you trying to do that, you feel poor at $30,000 with 2 kids, right? No, really. I mean that's a joke. Really, it's an insult. But we draw it at 19.5, I think. Still, I don't know. Maybe they changed it. But anyway, 25% poverty, 25% kids of color. You ought to be open enrollment. Like, these are supposed to be the best public high schools in America. Public to me means you get to come. I mean, you get to come. You get to show up. You live here. You go to school. Doesn't that make sense? So it should be open enrollment. And by God, they give you all this data. Whether it's open enrollment, they give you the data, and you can go down the list. Guess how many schools were left on the 100 by Gary Howard's criteria? 25% kids of color, 25% poverty, and open enrollment. 5 stayed. 95 schools drop off the list. Okay? And then I wanted to add another criteria, because I thought you should have 1,000 kids. Call yourself a high school. Let's have 1,000 kids. Okay? Because some of these have 57 kids. Charter with 102 kids, and by God, they're doing really well with them because they interviewed them to do well. That's how you got in, is that you're a good student. That's how you got here. Right? I'm not saying teachers say, Thomas Jefferson, if I went there, teachers would be insulted, right? They're good teachers. I'm not saying the teachers, TJ, you know what I'm talking about. They're not. It's not that they aren't good teachers. It's just don't make this the excellence agenda. The excellence agenda was when America shows up and you do a really good job teaching American kids. By America, I mean all the kids. I don't care whether they're legal or illegal, documented, not documented. They live in your community, they show up for school, and you do a good job with them, right? That's excellence. This is really hijacking a political agenda here. I write to them every year and say, why don't you change your list and use my criteria? No, I did. I write, the editor, the big editor, the main big guy wrote me back and said, we're not going to put your letter in our magazine. But he writes me and tells me he's not going to put it in. I thought that was fine. So if you drop the thing down and you get maybe 500 kids, there's a few more. There's 6 or 7 that emerge here. So maybe one of the lessons from Gary Howard is you got to have smaller schools. But I don't think so. There's good schools all over the country. Basically, we have words for this. A school that is excellent but is not inclusive. Remember those 3 words? Inclusion, excellence, equity. A school that's excellent, Thomas Jefferson, excellent school, prepares 100% of its kids for college. They go to really good colleges, right? A school that's excellent but it's not inclusive. We have a word for that. What is that? In other words, it's an excellent school, but America is not really showing up there. What do we call it? Segregation. We have an old word for that. Yeah, talk about rhetoric. There's an old word for that. What do you call a school that you do a really good job, but you're only doing a good job with this sort of enclave of privileged kids who are already destined for success? This word has already been mentioned tonight. What's that word? Where you're doing a really good job with a very isolated, privileged, already skids or grease group of kids. What do you call that? Elitism, right? So what you have here basically is a list of America's best segregated elitist high schools. Right? That's the letter I wrote. I said you could either call it America's segregated elitist high schools, or you could change the criteria and actually talk about good schools. To me, folks, particularly those of you going into teaching and education, good teaching shows up when diversity shows up. Good teaching shows up. I'm not saying you aren't a good teacher teaching in a suburban school or whatever, and middle class. And I mean, it's not that you aren't a good teacher. But the real teaching shows up when America shows up in your classroom. And that's what we need to prepare people for. I was not really prepared for that. Teacher Corps, I think, was a good way to do it. I mean, the best way they could possibly do it. But I had so much to learn after I got out of that program, right? So I want you to remember those 3 words. It's probably the main things for my part tonight. And the others, because I write a lot about white people, and Kristen, if I didn't mention white folks, she'd say that's why I was on the panel, to be white. But evidence, there's a lot of evidence that white folks in this country are not moving well towards 2050. So a huge piece of our work in the 21st century for multicultural, I was arguing this in 1976, and some of us were. It wasn't like I was the only one, but there's a little master's thesis here in the library that Gary Howard wrote, 1978. And the title is Multicultural Education in Monocultural Schools. It's there. You can go find it. It's probably all dusty. Probably it's all yellow and gone. I don't know. But maybe it's microfiched. This issue, this is also Sonia's point. This is an old issue, which is a very important 21st century agenda. Because how are we going to prepare our white students to live in a world where they are no longer the dominant cultural influence? Right? I mean, the dominance is going to last a long time. Let's be real. You don't need the numbers to be dominant. White dominance is going to die a difficult death in this country. The Tea Party is just a hint. You bring your AK-47 to a demonstration against a black president, and you don't get arrested in this country. You're called a patriot. Right? Well, I have some friends of mine in a neighborhood in New Haven, Connecticut. They also had a political party. They also carried weapons to their rallies. It was called the Black Panther Party. They were not called patriotic. So I think we have a serious lesson to learn here about our 21st century. All of us. It's not just a white people issue. That happens to be my group. It's not just a white people issue, but because 90% of teachers in this country are still white, there's a huge issue of preparing white folks. School reform in this country is in many ways about changing white people. I mean, we don't say that. We don't have a federal policy to change white people. I love white people. I mean, my children are white. But I think we just need to acknowledge in this country that this sign of the Tea Party, and the press talks about it being all white, but I don't think we've done a deep enough analysis of that thing, right? You elect your first black president, and hate group activity in the country triples, 300% since 2008 in terms of hate group activity. Who are they recruiting? Young, undereducated, low-income white kids. Right? So that's enough for me, really. I think that's enough for the 21st century. If we can do inclusion, excellence, and equity all hooked up, and everybody write a letter. I would encourage you, write a letter to U.S. News and World Report when they come out with the same list next year, okay? And to really pay attention to how we attempt to bring white America to the table of the 21st century in a way that can be healing. And there's wonderful, wonderful white teachers out there doing it. There is so many role models for how to do that. But it really needs to be replicated in our institutions of higher learning, in our school systems, and in America at large. Because school reform cannot be only done in schools. We learned that from all the school reform efforts. Now we got race to the top. Race to the top. I have trouble with two of the words. I like two of the words. To the, I like. To the. It's a sense of direction. I like it. Race, what happens with race? Winners and losers. Race to the top. Winners and losers. Top means top, we got bottom. I think we've had enough of this country around school reform with winners, losers, top and bottom. So we got to watch that one. Even though now it's the liberals, my folks doing it. Right? So we got to watch that one. Enough said. Thank you.
Wow. Do we have a panel or what? Oh my goodness. Let's give another round of applause for me. I think history was made tonight at Western Washington University. Thank you, Dean Salzman. Wow. All right, so this is your turn. And if you have questions that you've written down on a paper, please pass them to one of our seed folks who's coming around. But let's just jump in. Is there someone who has a question that would like to ask our panelists tonight? Great.
I would like to... Point guard right now who's on the Canadian